The Galactic Concordat had ruled the stars for 3,000 years, and nobody questioned their authority anymore, because questioning meant punishment, and punishment meant destruction of entire worlds. 5. Great alien races controlled everything worth controlling in the galaxy, and they called themselves the Enlightened Ones because they had achieved what they believed was the pinnacle of civilization. The Valkyrie were beings made of living crystal who could manipulate energy with their thoughts, and their ships gleamed like diamonds in the darkness of space. The Xian Collective operated as one massive hive mind where millions of insect-like creatures shared a single consciousness and made decisions with perfect unity. The Korthani Empire traced its lineage back 10,000 years, and their warriors stood 3 meters tall with 4 powerful arms and skin like armor plating. The Sindari Union had mastered technology beyond what most species could comprehend, and their artificial intelligence systems controlled fleets that moved faster than light itself. The Luminae were psychic beings who glowed with inner light and could read thoughts across vast distances and see possible futures in their meditations. These 5 powers had divided the galaxy into sectors and created laws that every species had to follow or face complete annihilation. Peace had reigned for so long that most aliens had forgotten what real war actually looked like. Then the sensors detected something impossible coming from a forgotten spiral arm that nobody had bothered to explore because the initial surveys showed nothing but primitive life forms and worthless rocks. A fleet was approaching, and it was moving through normal space instead of using dimensional portals or faster than light drives that every civilized species had mastered millennia ago. Monitoring stations could barely process what they were seeing because the numbers made no sense at all. 5,000 warships were crossing into protected territory, and each one looked like it had been built in a factory from some ancient era when species still used metal and chemical propulsion. The Concordat Council convened immediately and sent Ambassador Thelvos to intercept these unknown vessels before they caused any diplomatic incidents. Thelvos was a Valkyrie whose crystalline body had witnessed 4 centuries of successful negotiations, and he had never failed to bring primitive species into the Concordat fold. His vessel approached the lead ship, which bore strange markings that his translator identified as UNSC Indomitable in a language called English. When the communication channel opened, Thelvos saw a bipedal creature with smooth skin and forward-facing eyes that marked it as a predator species. The creature had hair on its head and wore a uniform covered in symbols and medals, and when it spoke, its voice carried the unmistakable tone of command authority. "This is Admiral Sarah Chun of the United Nations Space Command, and you are blocking our passage to the Kresh domain, so I suggest you move aside." Thelvos allowed his harmonic voice to fill with diplomatic warmth as he responded to this obviously ignorant species. "I am Ambassador Thelvos of the Galactic Concordat, and your species is unknown to our records, so we must establish proper first contact protocols before you can proceed further into protected space." The human female called Chun showed no deference or respect as she leaned forward in her command chair. "The Kresh raided our colony 6 months ago, and they took 40,000 of our people, and we tracked them back to their homeworld, and now we are going to get our people back." Thelvos felt a momentary confusion because the Kresh were a client species permitted limited raiding rights in unaffiliated space, and he had never heard of any species called humans or any human colonies. A quick scan of his databases showed Earth as a single planet in an unmonitored region that preliminary surveys had classified as pre-spaceflight civilization. Just 200 years ago, Ambassador Chen, such grievances must be addressed through proper Concordat channels, and we will launch a full investigation into these alleged raids. But you must understand that unauthorized military action is strictly forbidden under galactic law. Chun's expression changed into something cold and hard like frozen stone. We did our own investigation, and we found what was left of our people in crushed slave markets and processing facilities, and the rest are still alive somewhere on their homeworld. Her eyes bored into him with an intensity that made Thelvos uncomfortable despite his centuries of experience. You have 1 hour to move. Your ship's out of our path, and after that, anyone blocking our way becomes an enemy combatant. Thelvos tried to explain that the Concordat had maintained peace for thousands of years through careful diplomacy and established legal frameworks. Tried to make this primitive species understand that might did not make right, and that civilized beings resolve disputes through negotiation and arbitration. Chun cut him off mid-sentence. We tried negotiation, and we sent messages to your Concordat for 6 months while our people suffered, and nobody responded because we were not important enough to matter. She stood up from her chair, and the camera angle shifted to show her full height. We are done asking for permission, and we are done waiting for aliens who do not care about human lives to decide whether our people deserve justice. Thelvos saw the determination in her face and realized with growing alarm that this species would not back down. If you enter crash space without authorization, the Concordat will be forced to respond with military action, and I assure you that your primitive vessels stand no chance against our enforcement fleets. Chun smiled, but there was no humor in it at all. Then I guess we will find out just how primitive we really are. The communication channel closed, and Thelvos immediately transmitted an emergency report to the Concordat Council. The 5 ruling species gathered in their virtual chamber and reviewed the situation with growing disbelief. High Executor Ralmuth of the Korthony Empire dismissed the threat with a wave of his 4 massive arms. A single world challenges the entire Concordat with vessels that still use fusion drives and kinetic weapons like savages from the ancient past. Prime Node 77 of the Xian Collective pulsed agreement through the Hive network. Our smallest scout frigates mass more than their largest carriers, and our weapons can crack planets while there's fire metal slugs. Like prehistoric hunters. Sage Lumara of the Luminae spoke with her gentle psychic voice that carried undertones of concern. I reached out with my mind to touch theirs, and I found something strange, because their thoughts are shielded in ways I have never encountered before. Sindari. Counselor Zephyrin studied the technical data streaming from the sensor networks. They possess no phase shift technology and no dimensional fold drives, and no energy weapons beyond primitive lasers that could not penetrate even basic shielding. Ralmuth made his decision with the absolute certainty of someone who had crushed dozens of rebellions. Send the 47th Enforcement Fleet to disable their propulsion systems and bring their leaders to the Concordat for judgment and teach them the price of defiance. The 47th Fleet consisted of 80 warships, each capable of independently defeating most planetary defense forces and against 5,000 primitive vessels. It should have been overwhelming force where Master Krell received his orders and assembled his fleet with confidence born from 5 centuries of enforcing Concordat authority across rebellious sectors. Had fought in 17 enforcement actions and pacified dozens of frontier wars and maintained order through demonstration of overwhelming technological superiority. This would be routine work against primitives who did not understand the power they faced. His fleet took position across the human fleet's path, and Krell transmitted the final ultimatum. This is War Master Krell of the Concordat Enforcement Division, and you are ordered to power down your vessels immediately and prepare to be boarded or face neutralization. The human fleet did not slow down and did not respond and did not show any sign of fear or hesitation. Admiral Chun stood on her bridge surrounded by officers from every nation that had contributed ships to humanity's first Warfleet, and American and Russian and European and African and Asian officers all wore the same expression of grim determination. They think our numbers do not matter because our technology is inferior, Chun said quietly. They're about to learn what happens when you give apes fusion bombs and a reason to use them. Warmaster Krell had seen countless species surrender when faced with the might of the Concordat because resistance was futile against technology that had been refined over thousands of years. His 80 warships formed a barrier wall across space, with their phase shields active and their dimensional weapons charged and ready to disable any vessel that dared challenge Concordat authority. The human fleet approached without slowing, and Krell transmitted one final warning: power down immediately, or we will neutralize your vessels. The human formation suddenly split apart like a flower blooming in fast motion as 5,000 ships dispersed into dozens of smaller groups moving with practiced coordination that suggested extensive training. Krell's tactical officer monitored the maneuver with mild interest because no amount of fancy flying could overcome the technological gap between primitive fusion drives and dimensional fold engines. Then, the first missiles launched from the human fleet, and they came in waves of thousands, filling the space between the two forces with streaking contrails. Primitive kinetics detected. Krell's second-in-command reported with barely concealed amusement. Our phase shields will render them completely ineffective. The missiles did not target Krell's ships at all, and instead they detonated in carefully calculated patterns around the Concordat fleet. Each warhead was a fusion bomb that released massive electromagnetic pulses and clouds of metallic chaff that spread across millions of cubic kilometers. The phase shields flickered as they tried to process the sudden interference because they were designed to stop coherent energy beams and matter streams, not clouds of magnetically charged particles. Krell's sensor displays suddenly filled with static and jamming, and his targeting systems began throwing error codes as they lost lock on the human vessels. Evasive maneuvers, Krell ordered, but before his fleet could respond, the railguns opened fire. Humanity had learned warfare in the gravity wells of Earth, where stealth was impossible and every battle was decided by mathematics and timing and brutal calculations of trajectory. Their weapons were simple in concept, but devastating in execution because magnetic acceleration could propel metal slugs to percentages of light speed. Depleted uranium penetrators weighing several tons each crossed the distance in seconds, traveling so fast that relativistic effects made them even more massive. The phase shields that could bend space-time to deflect energy weapons and dimensional attacks had never been designed to stop solid matter moving at such velocities. The first Concordat cruiser took a railgun slug through its command deck, and the kinetic energy transfer vaporized everything along the projectile's path and turned the ship's bridge into superheated plasma. The second cruiser took 3 hits to its reactor compartment, and the containment fields failed catastrophically, and the resulting explosion consumed the vessel in a miniature star. The third ship's commander tried to activate the dimensional fold drive to escape, but a tactical nuclear warhead detonated inside the forming portal, and the resulting spatial anomaly ripped the ship and 2 others nearby into subatomic particles. Krell stared at his tactical display in disbelief as red icons began appearing where his ships had been just moments before. Humans were not fighting like any civilized species he had ever encountered, because they used their own damaged vessels as shields and positioned their fleet in overlapping formations that forced the Concordat ships to shoot through multiple targets. Their firing solutions were calculated using pure mathematics instead of sophisticated AI prediction algorithms, and this made their attacks unpredictable and difficult to counter. When one human ship was destroyed, 3 more immediately filled the gap and maintained the formation integrity, as if the loss meant nothing at all. Krell's weapons officer fired the main dimensional disruptors, and the beams tore through normal space, creating rifts that should have shredded the human vessels. Several human ships vanished into the dimensional tiers and were lost forever, but the rest simply adjusted their spacing and continued their attack. The human fleet absorbed losses that would have broken the morale of any civilized Military force because civilized species valued the lives of their crew members and retreated. When casualties became unacceptable, these humans kept coming as if they had accepted death before the battle even began. A human destroyer took a direct hit that blew off its entire aft section, but the surviving crew sealed the breaches and the ship continued firing its forward railguns until another shot finally destroyed it completely. Krull watched a human carrier lose main power and begin tumbling through space, and he expected it to surrender or at least stop fighting. Instead, the carrier's crew manually aimed their missile tubes, using visual targeting, and fired their entire remaining payload at his flagship. Missiles were primitive chemical rockets with fusion warheads, but there were hundreds of them, and they spread across multiple vectors, making interception impossible. Krull's flagship took 6 direct hits, and the explosions overwhelmed the face shields through sheer volume, and the last warhead penetrated deep into the engineering section before detonating. The main reactor went critical, and Krull barely had time to order evacuation before his command ship tore itself apart. He escaped in a life pod and watched the remainder of his fleet die around him, because the humans showed no mercy and gave no quarter. When 23 ships out of his original 80 managed to activate their full drives and escape, Krull saw the human fleet hold position. Instead of pursuing, they simply resumed their original course toward Kresh space as if the battle had been nothing more than a minor delay. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of the Indomitable and watched the alien survivors flee back to whatever hole they had crawled out of. Her tactical officer reported casualties, and the numbers made her heart heavy because each number represented lives lost and families destroyed. At 93 human ships had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair, and over 40,000 crew members were dead or missing. But the path to Kresh space was now clear. They fought well for their first real battle, her executive officer commented quietly. Chun shook her head slowly. They did not fight well at all because they fought according to rules that assumed their opponents would also follow those rules. She pulled up the tactical recordings and highlighted several moments where the Concordat ships had hesitated or held fire. When human vessels were obviously crippled, they gave us chances to surrender, and they tried to disable rather than destroy, and they pulled back when their own casualties reached 20%. Her XO understood immediately. They were trying to enforce order, not win a war. Chun nodded grimly. They have forgotten what total war actually means, because they have been the dominant power for so long that nobody has truly challenged them in thousands of years. She looked at the star chart showing the route to Kresh Prime. We are going to remind them what happens when you back a predator species into a corner and threaten its young. The communication systems began receiving frantic transmissions from the Concordat, demanding negotiations and ceasefire discussions and diplomatic solutions. Chen ignored all of them and gave the order to proceed at maximum velocity. Behind them, the wreckage of the battle drifted through space as a testament to what happens when advanced civilization met determined barbarism. The galaxy was about to learn a lesson that Earth had learned thousands of years ago. Technology could be overcome by tactics and superior numbers, and the willingness to pay any price for victory. And humanity had just announced to every species in the galaxy that they were willing to pay that price. News of the battle spread through Concordat space at the speed of light as monitoring stations transmitted reports and survivors gave their testimony. The 5 ruling species convened again, and this time there was no dismissive confidence in their deliberations. They destroyed 57 ships. Ralmuth repeated in disbelief, using primitive kinetic weapons and fusion bombs that any advanced species stopped using millennia ago. Zephyrin studied the battle recordings with growing unease. They fight without regard for their own survival, and they use tactics that sacrifice their own forces to achieve objectives, and they do not retreat when any rational species would withdraw. Sage Lumara's psychic voice trembled with something approaching fear. I touched the minds of the dying human crew members, and I felt no regret and no fear of death and only determination to complete their mission, even as their ships burned around them. Prime Node 77 pulsed confusion through the Zayan collective consciousness. This behavior pattern does not match any known species psychology, because self-preservation is the primary drive of all sentient life. Ralma stood on his four legs and his armored skin, darkened with anger. Then we sent more ships, and we crushed them with overwhelming force before they reached Crash Prime. 3. Full battle fleets were assembled totaling over 400 warships, representing the largest military force the Concordat had deployed in 500 years. They would arrive at Crash Prime before the humans and establish an impenetrable defensive perimeter. The galaxy would see that the Concordat's authority could not be challenged by primitives, no matter how suicidal their tactics. The Crash domain had existed for 800 years as a vassal state under Concordat protection, and their homeworld orbited a red giant star in a system fortified with orbital defense platforms and minefields and a permanent garrison of peacekeeping. Force Crash Prime itself was a world of dark red deserts and shallow, toxic seas where the Crash had built their civilization through conquest and slavery. The Crash were reptilian beings with scaled skin and multiple eyes and powerful limbs designed for tearing and crushing, and they had dominated their planet through sheer viciousness before the Concordat had arrived and imposed order under Concordat supervision. They were permitted limited raiding rights in unaffiliated space because the Concordat believed that allowing controlled violence prevented larger conflicts. Overlord Vexnar ruled Crash Prime from a palace built of bones and metal, and when he received word that humans were coming for their captured people, he laughed until his scales rattled. "Let them come," he hissed to his military commander. "Our defenses are impenetrable, and the Concordat fleets will crush these primitives long before they reach our world." Military Commander Zakros was less confident because the reports from the first battle suggested these humans were unlike any species the Concordat had faced before. They destroyed an enforcement fleet using inferior technology. Zakros warned, "Perhaps we should return their people and avoid further conflict." Vexnar's eyes blazed with anger. "We paid good credits for those slaves, and they were taken from unaffiliated space, which is completely legal under Concordat law, and I will not surrender valuable property because some upstart species throws a tantrum." The human fleet arrived 3 days later, and Zakros watched his sensors fill with contacts as 5,000 ships took up positions throughout the Crash system. But they did not attack and they did not charge the defenses, and instead, they began deploying thousands of small automated probes that spread across millions of kilometers. Within hours, the entire star system was blanketed with what the humans called Sentinel drones, and each one was a sensor platform and communication relay and weapons targeting node. Any ship that tried to leave the system was immediately tracked and destroyed by long-range missiles that accelerated 4 days before impact. "They are creating a blockade," Zakros reported with growing dread. "They are going to starve us out." Vexnar refused to believe the primitives could successfully besiege a Concordat-protected world. Then the human broadcast began transmitting on every frequency in multiple languages. "This is Admiral Sarah Chun of the United Nations Space Command speaking to the Crash leadership, and we have come to retrieve our people who were taken from our colonies." Her voice was calm and measured, but carried an undertone of absolute certainty. "You have 72 hours to return all 40,000 humans taken from our worlds, and they must be alive and unharmed and delivered to our fleet." There was a pause before she continued. "If you comply, we will depart peacefully and this matter will be settled, and if you do not comply, we will stop being reasonable." Vexnar broadcast his own message filled with threats and bravado about Concordat protection and superior firepower. Chun did not respond, and the human fleet simply maintained its positions while the Sentinel network grew denser with each passing hour. The 3 Concordat battle fleets arrived on the second day, with over 400 warships emerging from dimensional portals in a massive show of Force Fleet Commander Threkos had been given explicit orders to destroy the human fleet and teach the galaxy what happened to species who defied Concordat authority. His ships formed up in textbook battle formations with overlapping fields of fire and layered defensive screens. All vessels prepare to engage on my mark, Threkos commanded. We will destroy them quickly and decisively. The human fleet did not move from their scattered positions around the system, and Threkos wondered if they were going to surrender without a fight. Then the Sentinels activated. What Threkos did not know was that humanity had spent 3 days preparing the battlefield and seeding the entire system with millions of kinetic mines. Each mine was a simple metal sphere with chemical thrusters and basic guidance systems. And they had been drifting dormant through space waiting for their moment. When the Concordat fleets emerged from their dimensional portals, the human fleet activated every mine simultaneously. The Concordat ships were traveling at high velocity from their dimensional transitions, and they emerged directly into clouds of mines, moving at relativistic speeds. Face shields flickered and failed under the sheer volume of impacts as thousands of metal spheres slammed into warships with devastating kinetic energy. Ships that survived the initial impacts found themselves surrounded by more mines, accelerating toward them from multiple vectors. Threkos watched in horror as his perfectly formed battle lines disintegrated into chaos within minutes. Vessels collided with each other trying to evade the mine clouds, and those that activated their dimensional drives to escape often tore themselves apart because the drives were not designed to function in environments saturated with high-velocity debris. Through the chaos came the human warships firing their railguns with mathematical precision. They had calculated every trajectory and accounted for orbital mechanics and gravitational effects and target evasion patterns. Each shot was placed exactly where it needed to be, and the humans showed no hesitation about firing through their own minefields. Threkos tried to rally his forces and establish defensive perimeters, but the humans had turned the entire star system into a death trap. His flagship took 3 railgun hits in rapid succession, and the third one penetrated the reactor shielding. Threkos gave the order to abandon ship moments before the reactor detonated. He escaped in a life pod and watched the battle unfold around him and realized with sick certainty that the Concordat was losing. The humans fought like nothing in recorded history because they had anticipated every move and prepared countermeasures and were willing to sacrifice their own ships to achieve their objectives. A human cruiser deliberately rammed the Concordat dreadnought that was trying to rally the defense, and both ships exploded, but the dreadnought's destruction broke the Concordat formation. Completel. Threkos saw human destroyers swarm, damage Concordat vessels, and finish them with point-blank railgun fire. He watched as human carriers launched waves of fighters that used kamikaze tactics to destroy Concordat command ships. The battle lasted 16 hours, and when it finally ended, the void was filled with wreckage and debris and the frozen bodies of over 200,000 beings. The Concordat had lost over 200 ships, representing the largest single military defeat in their 3,000-year history. The human fleet had lost 93 vessels and over 40,000 crew members. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of the Indomitable and authorized the funeral ceremonies. Immediately, brief services were held across the fleet where the dead were honored and their bodies committed to the void of space with full military honors. Human crews wept for their fallen comrades and then returned to their stations because the mission was not yet complete. Chun watched the ceremonies on her monitor and felt the weight of every life lost. Her executive officer approached quietly. The Concordat is demanding negotiations. Chun turned away from the monitor. They can negotiate after we have our people back. She checked the chronometer and confirmed that 72 hours had expired. Begin orbital bombardment. The human fleet moved into position around Kresh Prime, and began systematically destroying the orbital infrastructure, not with overwhelming firepower or advanced weapons, but with patient, methodical precision that demonstrated humanity's greatest strength. Each orbital platform was targeted with railgun fire aimed at critical reactor systems until the platforms went dark. Each defensive satellite was eliminated by guided missiles that tracked them through evasive maneuvers. Defense grid that had protected Crash Prime for centuries was dismantled piece by piece. Crash defense forces fired back with everything they had, and human ships absorbed the damage and kept firing. A human destroyer lost its main engines, but continued using maneuvering thrusters to maintain position while its guns kept firing. A cruiser took a hit that killed half its crew, but the survivors sealed the damaged sections and kept fighting. Overlord Vexnar watched from his palace as his world's defenses crumbled and finally understood the terrible mistake he had made. These humans were not interested in conquest or territory or negotiation. They wanted their people back, and they would burn his entire civilization to achieve that goal. He gave the order to release the human captive Crash soldiers, dragged the surviving humans from detention facilities and processing centers, and slave markets. Out of 40,000 taken, only 3,412 remained alive. The rest had died in captivity or been sold to other species, or killed when they proved too difficult to break. Admiral Chun stood in the hangar bay of the Indomitable as the first transport ships brought the survivors aboard. She saw children with hollow eyes, and adults with broken spirits, and elderly people who could barely stand. Every survivor bore the marks of captivity and torture and abuse. A Marine carried a young girl no more than 8 years old, and the child's eyes showed trauma that no human should ever experience. But she was alive and she was going home. Chun felt tears on her face and did not bother to wipe tea. The Galactic Concordat Council assembled in their virtual chamber for what would become the most important session in their 3,000-year history. The 5 ruling species appeared as holographic projections surrounded by data streams showing the catastrophic losses at Crash Prime. High Executor Ralmuth of the Korthani Empire stood on his 4 legs, and his armored skin had darkened to the color of old blood. This cannot stand, and we cannot allow a primitive species to dictate to the most powerful alliance in galactic history. Sindari Counselor Zephyrin displayed tactical analyses across multiple screens showing human combat doctrine and weapons capabilities. They possess technology that we abandoned 10,000 years ago. Yet they defeated our best fleets through tactics that we never anticipated, because we assumed all species would fight according to established conventions. Prime Node 77 pulsed through the Xian collective network with confused patterns. Humans lost over 130 ships across both engagements and suffered over 80,000 casualties. Yet they show no signs of stopping or retreating. Sage Lumara of the Lumine spoke with her psychic voice, carrying undertones of deep concern. I have been studying their historical databases, and what I found terrifies me, because these beings have been fighting each other for their entire existence. She projected images from Earth's history across the chamber. Humans standing in trenches while chemical weapons drifted across no man's land. Cities vaporized by atomic weapons that humanity had developed and immediately used against themselves. Wars that consumed entire continents and killed millions upon millions. They have faced extinction dozens of times through natural disasters and plagues and climate change, and they survived every catastrophe through sheer determination. Lumara's glow dimmed with something approaching fear. They developed weapons capable of destroying their own planet, and they built thousands of them and aimed them at each other for decades. Ralmuth dismissed the images with a wave of his massive arms. Ancient history and irrelevant superstition, and we possess weapons that make their primitive atomics look like children's toys. Zephyrin highlighted casualty projections on his displays. Our analysts estimate that fully destroying the human fleet currently at Crash Prime would require deploying at least 15 additional battle fleets, and we would suffer losses exceeding 40%. The chamber fell silent as the implications became clear. And that assumes they do not have reinforcements, Zephyrin continued. Our intelligence suggests Earth is currently constructing at least 10 more war fleets of similar size. Ralmuth roared in fury. Then we destroy Earth itself, and we end this threat before it spreads. Lumara's psychic presence flared with alarm. You would commit genocide against an entire species because they dared to rescue their own people. I would eliminate a threat to galactic stability. Ralmuth countered before the argument could escalate further. Admiral Chun's message arrived. The communication appeared on every display simultaneously, and Chun's face showed the weariness of someone who had witnessed too much death. Members of the Galactic Concordat, I am Admiral Sarah, Chun of the United Nations Space Command, and I am transmitting this message from Kresh Prime. Behind her, the view screen showed the shattered remains of Kresh orbital defenses drifting through space. You allowed the Kresh to raid our colonies, and you ignored our diplomatic requests for 6 months, and you demanded we follow your laws while our people suffered in captivity. Chun's voice remained calm, but carried an edge of absolute conviction. We came here to teach you a lesson about what happens when you mistake patience for weakness and compassion for cowardice. She leaned forward slightly. We are not interested in joining your Concordat, and we are not interested in following laws we never agreed to, and we are especially not interested in letting aliens who profit from slavery tell us how civilized beings should behave. Ralmuth prepared to respond with threats, but Chun continued. Here are humanity's terms, and they are not negotiable. First, all human colonies and territories are now sovereign space under Earth's protection, and any species that attacks human interests will face our full military response. Second, the Concordat will formally recognize Earth as an independent power with full territorial rights, and we will be offered a seat at your council table. Third, a memorial will be established at Kresh Prime listing every name of every human taken, and the Kresh will maintain it in perpetuity. Chun's expression hardened into something cold and merciless. You believe you can destroy us through overwhelming force, and you are probably correct, because your technology is superior and your numbers are greater. She smiled, and it was the Predator's expression that had allowed humanity to dominate Earth. But ask yourselves how many ships you are willing to lose and how many of your people you are willing to sacrifice, and whether maintaining your pride is worth the cost. Because we will fight until every ship is destroyed and every human is dead before we surrender or retreat. That is the difference between us and you. Fight to maintain order, while we fight because we refuse to lose. The communication channel remained open, waiting for response. The Concordat Council deliberated in private session for 3 days while the human fleet maintained position around Kresh. Ralmuth argued for total war and the complete destruction of humanity regardless of cost. Zephyrin presented economic analyses showing that even victory would devastate the Concordat's military capacity for decades. The ZN Collective calculated probability matrices and found no scenario where the Concordat emerged stronger. Lumara reached out with her psychic abilities and touched the minds of humans across the fleet. What she found made her withdraw in shock. They mean every word, she reported to the council. Every single human in that fleet has accepted that they will die, and they are at peace with that outcome because they believe their sacrifice will protect future generations. She tried to make the others understand. This is not bravado or bluffing, and they have already mourned their own deaths. And now they simply wait for us to force their hand. Prime Node 77 processed the information through millions of individual Jan minds. If we destroy them, Earth will send another fleet, and then another, and they will keep coming until either we are defeated or they are extinct. Zephyrin added the final piece of analysis. And while we are focused on humanity, our enemies within the Concordat will see opportunity, and our 3,000-year peace will collapse into civil war. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Fighting humanity would cost more than it would gain. Rolmuth stood alone in his position as the other four species reached consensus. The Corthony High Executor finally bowed his massive head in acknowledgement of reality. Then we give them what they demand, and we hope we can contain this threat before it spreads. Sage Lumara composed the response and ensured it carried proper diplomatic weight. Admiral Chun, after careful deliberation, the Galactic Concordat agrees to your terms, and humanity will be recognized as a sovereign power with full territorial rights. Seat on the Concordat Council will be offered to Earth, and the memorial at Kresh Prime will be established as requested. There was a pause before Lumara added the final acknowledgement. We also offer our formal apology for failing to respond to your initial diplomatic communications, and we recognize that this tragedy could have been avoided through proper attention to your grievances. Admiral Chen received the response and read it carefully before calling her senior staff together. They are giving us everything we demanded, our executive officer observed. Chen nodded slowly. Because we proved we were willing to pay any price, and they were not. She looked at the casualty reports, showing the names of over 80,000 dead. But the price was still too high. Her chief medical officer spoke quietly. The survivors we recovered will need years of therapy, and some of them may never fully recover from what they endured. Chun stood and walked to the viewport, showing Kresh Prime below. Then, we make sure this never happens again, and we build enough ships and train enough crews that no species ever thinks about raiding human space. She turned back to her staff. Send word to Earth that we are coming home and tell them to accelerate the construction of the new fleets. The galaxy knows we exist now, and they know what we are capable of when threatened. Her tactical officer raised a concern. Some species might see us as a threat and attempt preemptive strikes. Chun smiled grimly. Let them try, and let them learn the same lesson the Concordat just learned. Humanity does not start fights, but we always finish them. The human fleet began preparations for the long journey back to Earth, while leaving behind a garrison force to ensure the Kresh complied with the memorial requirements. Across the galaxy, news of humanity's victory spread through 1 million channels and sparked 1 million different reactions. Some species saw humanity as potential allies against Concordat dominance. Others viewed them as dangerous primitives who needed to be contained. And some simply watched and waited to see what these strange beings would do next on Earth. Billions of humans celebrated the return of their people and mourned those who had died. Governments accelerated military spending, and shipyard construction universities established new departments dedicated to studying alien technology and tactics. Humanity had taken its first steps onto the galactic stage, and the human Warfleet began its journey home, and the trip would take 8 months traveling through normal space, because humanity still lacked the dimensional fold technology that would make the journey instantaneous. Admiral Chun used that time to compile comprehensive reports on everything they had learned about galactic military capabilities and alien psychology and the political structure that governed the stars. Every engagement was analyzed in detail, and every tactical decision reviewed, and every lesson learned documented for future commanders. The survivors received medical treatment and psychological counseling, and the fleet's doctors worked around the clock to help them recover from their trauma. Some of the rescued humans had been held captive for months and bore physical scars that would never fully heal. Others had witnessed horrors that haunted their dreams and would require years of therapy. But they were alive, and they were free, and they were going home. Chun visited the medical bays regularly and spoke with survivors when they were ready to talk. A woman named Maria Torres had been taken from the colony on New Santiago and spent 4 months in Kresh captivity. They treated us like animals. Maria said quietly, like we were nothing but property to be bought and sold. Chun listened without interruption as Maria described the conditions in the slave markets. But you came for us, Maria continued with tears streaming down her face. You came across the galaxy and fought aliens we had never even heard of, and you brought us home. Chun took Maria's hand gently. Every single life matters, and that is not just words, but the principle that guided every decision we made. Similar conversations happened across the fleet as survivors began processing their experiences and understanding the sacrifice that had been made for their rescue. Meanwhile, the Galactic Concordat struggled to adjust to the new reality that humanity represented. Ambassador Thelvos was assigned as the primary liaison to Earth, and he began studying human history and culture with obsessive focus. What he learned disturbed him profoundly because humanity's development followed patterns that no other species had exhibited. Most civilizations developed peaceful cooperation before achieving spaceflight because species that remained violent typically destroyed themselves. Humanity had achieved nuclear weapons before leaving their planet and had come within moments of total nuclear war. Multiple times, they had fought two global conflicts that killed hundreds of millions using increasingly destructive technology. They had developed biological weapons and chemical weapons and weapons specifically designed to cause maximum suffering, and yet somehow they had also developed democracy and human rights and international cooperation. Thelvos struggled to reconcile these contradictions until he finally understood something fundamental about human nature. Humans were capable of extraordinary compassion and terrible violence, and the choice between them was made consciously rather than instinctively. They could be the galaxy's greatest allies or worst enemies, depending entirely on how they were treated. He transmitted this analysis to the Concordat Council along with a strong recommendation. Humanity must be integrated into galactic society carefully and with genuine respect, because if we treat them as primitives or threats, they will become exactly that. Sage Lumara read his report and agreed completely. They're still close enough to their violent past that war comes naturally to them, but they are also developing moral frameworks that could eventually make them more peaceful than any species in the Concordat. She addressed the council directly. We have two choices, and we can welcome them and help guide their development, or we can oppose them and face endless conflict. Ralmuth remained skeptical. They are too dangerous to be trusted, Zephyrin countered with economic projections, and too valuable to be ignored because their industrial capacity is remarkable and their population growth rate exceeds any species we have encountered. In 200 years, they will have colonies throughout their entire sector, and in 500 years, they could rival the Concordat itself. The council voted and humanity was officially recognized with full diplomatic status. A formal delegation would travel to Earth to establish permanent relations and negotiate trade agreements and cultural exchanges. But privately, many council members wondered whether they had made a terrible mistake. On Earth, the returning Warfleet was greeted as heroes and millions gathered to welcome them home. The survivors were reunited with families who had thought them lost forever. The fallen were honored with memorial services attended by heads of state and common citizens alike. Admiral Chun stood at Arlington National Cemetery and watched as the first burials took place. Rows of white headstones stretched into the distance, and each one represented a life given in service to humanity. The President of the United Nations approached her quietly. You did what everyone said was impossible, and you brought our people home. Chun stared at the graves. Not all of them, and 36,000 did not make it back. The president placed a hand on her shoulder. But 3,000 did, and that would not have happened without you. Chun turned to face him. The galaxy is more dangerous than we imagined, and there are species out there with technology we cannot match and resources we cannot compete with. But they are also complacent, and they have forgotten how to really fight because they have relied on their technological superiority for so long. The president understood immediately. You are saying we have an advantage? Chun nodded. For now we do because they think in terms of acceptable losses and calculated risks, while we think in terms of total commitment. But that advantage will not last because they will adapt and they will learn our tactics and eventually technology will overcome. Determination. She looked up at the sky where stars were becoming visible in the twilight. We need to use this time to catch up technologically. And we need to build alliances, and we need to establish ourselves as a power that cannot be ignored or dismissed. The president asked the question that everyone wanted answered. Can we survive out there? Chun considered carefully before responding. Humanity has survived ice ages and plagues and wars and disasters that should have destroyed. You and we are still here. The galaxy is just another challenge, and we will either adapt and overcome, or we will die trying. But I would not bet against humanity. Construction began on 10 new warfleets, each one incorporating lessons learned from the Crash Campaign shipyards, operated around the clock, and millions volunteered for military service. Scientists worked to reverse engineer captured alien technology while maintaining Earth's unique tactical advantages. Diplomats established contact with other species who were interested in alternatives to Concordat dominance. And in classrooms across Earth, children learned about Admiral Chun and the rescue mission that had changed humanity's place in the galaxy. Teachers explained that courage meant doing what was right, even when it was dangerous. That compassion meant protecting those who could not protect themselves. That humanity's greatest strength was not technology or weapons, but the willingness to sacrifice for each other. 10 years passed, and humanity established dozens of new colonies, protected by orbital defense platforms and patrol fleets. Trade routes opened with species who appreciated human manufacturing capabilities and industrial efficiency. Cultural exchanges brought alien music and art and philosophy to Earth while humans shared their own diverse heritage. The Concordat Council welcomed Earth's representative Ambassador James Martinez, who had been carefully selected for his diplomatic skills and deep understanding of both human and alien psychology. Martinez's first speech to the council was brief and memorable. Humanity comes to this chamber not as conquerors or supplicants, but as equals, who earned our place through blood and determination. We offer friendship to those who respect us, and we promise unrelenting opposition to those who threaten us. We bring to this council things that have been forgotten, and the memory of what it means to fight for survival, and the understanding that peace must be defended, not merely declared. Sage Lumara responded with genuine warmth. Then let us build that peace together and create a galaxy where no species lives in fear of raiders or slavers. Ralmuth remained silent, but his body language suggested grudging acceptance. Humanity had proven itself, and now it was time to see whether they could build as effectively as they could. Destroy. 50 years passed, and a new generation of humans grew up knowing the galaxy as their birthright. They explored strange worlds and formed friendships with aliens and pushed the boundaries of science and art. The memorial at Kresh Prime became a pilgrimage site where humans and aliens alike came to remember the price of injustice. The names of 40,000 humans were carved in stone, along with the names of over 200,000 Concordat personnel who had died in the conflict. It served as a reminder that war was costly for everyone, and that peace required constant effort. Admiral Chun retired at age 70 and spent her remaining years teaching at the newly established Galactic Naval Academy. Students from dozens of species attended her lectures on tactics and strategy and military ethics. She never let them forget the central truth that had guided her career. Technology will always advance and tactics will always evolve, but the fundamental question remains constant.